Everywhere we turn, we are bombarded with messages encouraging us to indulge in the ephemeral joys of consumerism, technology, and superficial experiences. This relentless chase for immediate satisfaction has woven itself into the very fabric of our daily existence, promising happiness and fulfillment. Advertisements bombard us with the promise that happiness can be purchased. The latest gadgets, fashion, and luxury items are touted as essential for a fulfilling life. However, the joy derived from acquiring these items is often short-lived, giving way to a cycle of perpetual longing for the next best thing. This relentless consumerism creates a sense of inadequacy and dissatisfaction, as we are constantly reminded of what we lack, rather than appreciating what we have. It creates a culture where worth is measured by material possessions, rather than purpose and personal achievements. Beneath this glittering surface lies a hollow void, an empty existence masked by the fleeting thrills of the moment. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche offered freedom from this perpetual cycle of addiction and meaninglessness. You won't need to follow some brutal regime of abstinence. Abstinence is a coward's escape, a sure path to failure, embraced only by the weak and the misguided. The problem with this life of excessive indulgence is that it diminishes our personal power. Personal power is the energy and focus necessary to live a purposeful and impactful life. Indulgence, by consuming our attention and energy on trivial pleasures, depletes this power, leaving us weakened and less capable of pursuing more meaningful goals. You may have noticed that when you indulge in one pleasure, it becomes much easier to indulge in the next. Each subsequent pleasure creates a craving for even more, until we lose control over our desires. Each time we give in, it takes significant effort to return to abstinence or moderation. Eventually, we start to feel burnt out from the constant stimulation. Our minds struggle to focus, and our resolve is so weakened by indulgence that we can't resist the next tempting experience. So, how do we break this never-ending cycle that diminishes our strength and leaves us feeling disgusted with ourselves? How do we win this battle? You might expect me to suggest giving up pleasure and adopting a brutally restrictive lifestyle. Not at all. In fact, you should never deprive yourself of any pleasure. I share the sentiment of Michel de Montaigne when he wrote, "I hate this inhuman wisdom that will have us despise and hate all culture of the body. I look upon it as an equal injustice to loathe natural pleasures as to be too much in love with them. A man should neither pursue nor avoid them, but receive them." Abstinence, though often advocated as a means to control indulgence, tends to lead to a cycle of relapse and recovery. When we attempt to repress our desires or completely abstain from satisfying them, we engage in a constant battle against our own nature. This struggle can be exhausting, gradually weakening our resolve and making us more susceptible to succumbing to our impulses. The resultant guilt and shame from these relapses further entrench us in a cycle of indulgence, as we seek to numb these negative emotions through the very behaviors we aim to avoid. Abstinence, therefore, can often result in a diminished sense of personal power and increased vulnerability to the allure of immediate pleasures. Pleasure itself isn't a bad thing. In fact, life would be intolerable without moments of pleasure. The key is the type of pleasure and how we attain it. Addiction isn't always about the pleasure itself. Sometimes we fall into addiction because our lives lack meaning and fulfillment. This void leads us to indulge in pleasures to feel better or to numb the pain. Many philosophers have argued that the best pleasure comes from engaging in meaningful activities. Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, believed that overcoming challenges can bring genuine pleasure. Before I explain this alternative, we first need to understand Nietzsche's perspective on pleasure. Nietzsche criticized hedonist doctrines that place human motivation solely in the pursuit of pleasure. There are two main types of hedonism. Epicureanism divides pleasure into bodily and mental. Bodily pleasures, like eating delicious food, only exist in the present. Mental pleasures, such as joy and pleasant memories, can exist in the past, present, and future, making them greater. Epicureans value mental pleasure more and believe true pleasure comes from the absence of pain and a peaceful mind. Their goal is to achieve a state free from physical and mental pain. The other kind of hedonism doesn't necessarily seek pleasure on an individual basis. One example, utilitarianism, proposed by John Stuart Mill, seeks to maximize happiness for the most people. Utilitarianism aims to create ethical guidelines that increase overall happiness by considering the greatest good for the greatest number. Mill emphasizes that actions are right if they promote happiness and wrong if they produce the opposite. This doctrine evaluates the moral worth of actions based on their outcomes and their contribution to overall well-being. Nietzsche dismisses these two approaches for two reasons. First, they both consider pleasure to be the opposite of pain, suggesting that minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure leads to ultimate good and human flourishing, whether for individuals or society. The problem with this view is that pain is not the opposite of pleasure. Simply trying to diminish pain to maximize pleasure is a futile and foolish endeavor, because pain is a necessary ingredient for experiencing pleasure. According to Nietzsche, pain is distinct from pleasure, but not its opposite. He proposes that pleasure is not derived from the elimination of pain, but from the act of overcoming resistance or the effective exercise of agency. It was on these grounds that Nietzsche criticized the idea of pure pleasure. Why is all activity, even that of a sense, associated with pleasure? Because before it an obstacle, a burden existed? Or rather because all doing is an overcoming, a becoming master, and increases the feeling of power? The second reason Nietzsche dismisses hedonist doctrines is that they place pleasure as the ultimate motive behind all human striving. While it may seem like humans pursue pleasure, Nietzsche argues that they are more fundamentally driven by the desire for power, growth, and mastery. We can only feel our power increasing in the presence of resistance, which often involves pain and discomfort. The true pleasure we derive comes not from simply obtaining what we want, but from the successful striving for it. Pleasure, as Nietzsche sees it, is the feeling of increased power, residing not in the possession of something, but in the experience of effectively exercising our will. This ability to shape or exploit our world in accordance with our will is the essence of the feeling of power, and hence is deeply pleasurable. Pleasure is every increase of power, displeasure every feeling of not being able to resist or dominate. If the hedonists of the Epicurean or utilitarian school of thought wish to increase their pleasure or happiness, they must necessarily seek out challenges and obstacles. These challenges test their striving for power and mastery, allowing them to overcome these obstacles and experience true pleasure. Thus, Nietzsche proposes that one could describe pleasure in general as a rhythm of little unpleasurable stimuli. What is a pleasure but an excitation of the feeling of power by an obstacle, even more strongly by rhythmic obstacles and resistances, so it swells up. Thus, all pleasure includes pain. Nietzsche regarded the Stoics as consistent in treating pain and pleasure with indifference, because if one wishes to reduce pain, they must also reduce pleasure. According to Nietzsche, there is no such thing as pure pleasure, unmixed with displeasure. Once pleasure is properly understood as a feeling of power, it becomes evident that pain is a necessary ingredient of pleasure. Nietzsche even goes as far as to say that pain is the father of pleasure, and that pleasure itself is a kind of pain. Thus, the will to seek pleasure is not compatible with the will to avoid pain. Those who court pleasure are also courting pain. What if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wanted to have as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other? That whoever wanted to learn to jubilate up to the heavens would also have to be prepared for depression unto death? There simply is no striving for pleasure, but only a striving for power. This is because pleasure is ultimately the feeling of power. Pleasure arises when we are successful in attaining our goals, or rather, in proportion to the resistance we overcome in pursuit of those goals. A state of pure pleasure or pure pain is not possible. On these grounds, Nietzsche rejects conventional hedonism. It is not the satisfaction of the will that causes pleasure, but rather the will's forward thrust and again, becoming master over that which stands in its way. The feeling of pleasure lies precisely in the dissatisfaction of the will, in the fact that the will is never satisfied unless it has opponents and resistance. Nietzsche's rejection of traditional hedonism does not mean he rejects hedonism entirely. Rather, he seeks to redefine it, grounding it in the striving for power rather than pleasure. This redefinition has some interesting practical implications. If pleasure is the feeling of power derived from overcoming resistance and effectively exercising our will, then we can leverage this understanding to spur ourselves toward greater achievements. By embracing challenges and obstacles, we can experience greater pleasure through the empowerment that comes from mastering these difficulties. Indeed, the awareness of this fact will sometimes induce agents to create obstacles to satisfaction deliberately. Since the modern hedonistic cycle of indulgence and the void that follows is not a practical way to live, Nietzschean hedonism could offer a valuable alternative. Instead of indulging in the ready-made pleasures of modern life, we could embrace the idea of seeking happiness in overcoming challenges and exercising our will creatively. We could pursue this sort of pleasure rather than substituting it for modern goods, which are designed to hack the brain's reward centers. By focusing on self-creation and striving for excellence, we play a different game, one that leads to a fulfilling life with its own share of pleasures. These pleasures, unlike those derived from mere indulgence, would signify our self-improvement and personal power. As Nietzsche writes, "It seems a little hindrance that is overcome and immediately followed by another little hindrance that is again overcome." This game of resistance and victory arouses most strongly that general feeling of superabundant, excessive power that constitutes the essence of pleasure. If we follow the path of abstinence or the Stoic ideal of indifference, we miss out on one of the most positive aspects of our experience. Instead, we can use our desires to spur ourselves on to greater accomplishments, and we will be rewarded for our achievements with the pleasure that accompanies overcoming challenges. Thus, our pleasure will not be in owning any object, but in the act of overcoming itself. Some live as slaves to their impulses, while others live in fear of their impulses if they are uncontained. But mastery allows us to turn these devils into angels. Such a path is the way to true freedom. Mastery over the passions, not their weakening or extirpation. The greater the will's power of mastery, the more freedom may be given to the passions. The great human being is great by virtue of the range of free play of his desires, and of the still greater power that is able to take these magnificent monsters into service. Nietzsche holds a positive view towards our impulses, seeing them as sources of strength and vitality. He describes them as one and all useful, provided they can be mastered and spiritualized. These natural forces, when considered in economic terms, are essential sources of vitality. They become fatalities only when they lack structure and discipline. We must learn to harness both their raw energy and their inherent foolishness. There is a time with all passions when they are mere fatalities, when they drag their victim down with the weight of their folly, and a later, very much later time when they are wedded with the spirit, when they are spiritualized. Nietzsche speaks of transforming the passion of mankind, one and all, into joy. By doing so, we become spiritually joyful, luminous, and honest individuals who have transformed our passions into something artistic and illuminating. The goal is not to repress our impulses, but to overcome them, thereby entering into a state of divine ownership. In this state, we own our appetites instead of being owned by them. Giving style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is exercised by those who see all the strengths and weaknesses of their own natures, and then comprehend them in an artistic plan until everything appears as art and reason, and even weakness delights the eye. The other two options, abstinence and indifference, involve devaluing our most valuable sources of vitality. Instead of seeking mastery, they aim to escape from our true selves. These approaches diminish our energy and creative responsibility, or they falsely sublimate the sources of life. In contrast, harnessing our vital impulses through a process of cultivation slows decadence and fosters openness towards what would otherwise be suppressed. Suppression and false sublimation represent an attitude of turning one's back on life and creative responsibility. This ultimately leads to decadence, pessimism, and nihilism. The more traditional moral position views our impulses as bad and in need of suppression. Rather than taking these sources of strength and economizing them, this harmful perspective seeks to eradicate them entirely. However, such eradication would result in castration, both literally and metaphorically. Just because you cannot constrain your desires does not mean you are weak. It might mean the opposite. There's a quote from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell that I love. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. Instead of indifference and suppression, Nietzsche chose the view from above, a state where emotions are organized into a hierarchy, a gradient. In this gradient, pain holds a lower position, but not the lowest, while joyfulness and affirmation occupy the highest. He insists that we must descend this gradient toward suffering. Such a descent represents becoming conscious by entering the lower dimensions of the self, far from the heights of joy that we can attain through this down-going. By embracing fate in all its pathways, our past pains and suffering are affirmed as states we have willed. To redeem the past in this way is to transform every "it was" into "I wanted it thus." Your love of life shall be love of your highest hope, and your highest hope shall be the highest thought of life.